Good evening, assalamu alaikum. Welcome back. This is News in Focus. My name is Faraz Patel. Jazakallah so much for staying with us. Now, we all saw what happened on Friday, a massive historic ruling by the International Court of Justice. And activists and legal experts in the West Bank are saying that with Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories declared unlawful, what will it do to improve the life for Palestinians? Other states must now apply collective pressure on Israel to end its current occupation over Gaza and the West Bank, including annexed East Jerusalem, if the situation is there to change. Joining us now, I'd like to welcome Zainah Haroun. She is the spokesperson of Al-Haq to break this down, and we're going to take most of the show to discuss the Zainah. Assalamu alaikum, and shukran so much for joining us here on News in Focus on Hilaal TV.
Wa alaikum salam, and thank you so much for having me to talk about such an important and historic moment, as you mentioned.
I mean, no, it's an absolute pleasure, definitely. Zainah, it's been 76 years since the Nakba, and of course, it took what is currently happening in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, to really put in place what is happening with regards to the different court cases of the ICJ, and of course, South Africa have their own. Talk to us about this. Talk to us about how historic this ruling was on Friday.
This was an extremely significant ruling which took place on Friday, and because the World Court, the main judicial organ of the United Nations, affirmed what Palestinian activists, Palestinian human rights organizations, international human rights organizations, and even Israeli human rights organizations have been saying for years. The occupation is unlawful, natural resources are being pillaged, a system of racial discrimination and apartheid is in place across the occupied Palestinian territory. The territory in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, Gaza, is in fact occupied. It's not disputed territory, as the Israelis have tried to claim and change the narrative for so many times over the past few decades. And the Israelis should remove themselves immediately, end the occupation as rapidly as possible, and not only this, allow Palestinians the right of return to the land, which they de facto annexed, not even just Jerusalem, as you said. The court actually ruled that there is a de facto annexation in other parts of the occupied Palestinian territory, such as the West Bank, and those people should be allowed to return to their land, and even reparations should be made.
Zainah, let's talk about obviously land, because this is where I think most of the discussion comes in, because what we've seen pre-Nakba and post-Nakba was that settlers who came from different parts of Europe had of course been starting to eat into the lands of the West Bank. And that was something that was of course mentioned during the ICJ ruling. And it speaks really of the historical aspect of this, that families were basically told, you're either going to abide or we're going to kick you out. And you saw many of these Palestinian families really walking away, knowing that there was violent repression that was happening via the different armed groups of the Zionist entities. And that is telling, isn't it, just how much that historical aspect is brought into the faith?
Of course. So Israel has always been a settler colonial apartheid regime. And in that settled colonial element of its regime, its aim is to remove the indigenous population and replace, which is very specific to Israel's type of colonialism, to replace with its own population, which is, of course, a war crime, a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits completely the transfer of the indigenous population, or the population that is being occupied, out of the territory, and then the transfer of your own population into the territory that you're occupying. Over the years, Israel has tried to claim that this is disputed, that what they're doing is actually legal. They've even tried to bring in religion into the argument, but the International Court of Justice said authoritatively that this is absolutely illegal, that is not disputed territory, that this is occupied Palestinian territory, and even Gaza, which they've tried to claim isn't occupied, is still under Israeli effective control, even more so after October 7th, and you cannot fragment this territory and put it under different categories. This is all one contiguous occupied Palestinian territory, and Israel needs to remove itself immediately. And as you're talking about the slow kind of take over the land, so obviously Israeli settlers have come from all over the world, not even just Europe. and they've been eating away at a certain part of the West Bank, which is called Area C, which is made up of over 60% of the West Bank, which is under full Israeli military control. This means anytime you want to build a road or a house or a clinic or use the water supply, you have to get a permit from the Israelis, which the United Nations says is nearly impossible to get. So what we've seen is this intense, significant expansion over the decades of illegal Israeli settlements and the development of Israeli settlements, while simultaneously any Palestinian development has been inhibited and has been prevented. Because if you can't get a building permit, you're going to build a house anyway, you're going to build a clinic anyway, you're going to build some infrastructure. Even some communities have built roads and infrastructure with their own hands. And the day after, they've seen Israelis put rocks back on those roads because they didn't get a permit for that road, which was a vital source of transport for communities trying to get to a hospital or a clinic. And this has created not even just the physical removal of communities from over 60% of the West Bank, what we call a coercive environment, where life was made so miserable, so difficult, almost impossible for Palestinians to live in that area, that they pick up and leave themselves to live in the smaller parts of the West Bank, which is slightly easier to live in. Now, the International Court of Justice addressed this, and they still said that this was forcible transfer. Even if they voluntarily moved themselves, the coercive environment that was created by the Israelis in the first place makes it still amount to forcible transfer under international law, which was a very important aspect for the ICJ to cover.
Zainah, another interesting part of this is livelihoods of the Palestinians in the occupied territory. Now, many of the residents of the West Bank are either farmers or, do activities which contribute towards the agricultural sector of that very same area. And we've seen these families, these farmers being cut off due to the Israeli expansion. Many of that, of course, the olive and the date trees. And what was interesting is that this livelihood, this cutoff, was mentioned, that when you look at it, this is another way of really trying to cut off to put it to you this way, cut off the actual hand to mouth that these Palestinians have worked so hard for. That was interesting, wasn't it?
The amount of compensation that will be needed, reparations that were ruled by the ICJ, are extremely significant, because the amount of damage, the amount of loss for Palestinian communities, even farmers or even families who really rely on that olive harvest, like you said, for some families, especially villagers, they live off this olive harvest for the entire year. We can't stress to you how much the Israeli occupation and the settler colonial apartheid regime, how much it impacts every tiny aspect of Palestinian life. Even at the genocide case at the ICJ, South Africa versus Israel, earlier on in the year, they said, I remember they made an extremely strong case, the South African team, and they said that the occupation impacts everything from birth to death. I would take that even further. The occupation impacts Palestinians from before birth and after death. Anything from planting a tree, from accessing your land, from traveling from city to city. And the reason that I say that it actually impacts Palestinians before birth and after death is because we met so many communities who couldn't even, pregnant women who couldn't even get to a clinic because the Israeli occupier wouldn't allow them to build the sufficient infrastructure, and it made it incredibly difficult. So they were missing their pregnancy appointments at the doctors. And of course, in Gaza now, as you see with the ongoing genocide, we see how pregnant women have been severely and significantly impacted because they're being starved and the babies are coming out premature. So this is how it's impacting it before birth. Now, after death, we know that the Israeli occupation, the way that they detain Palestinians, the way that they arrest Palestinians arbitrarily in ways that are in violation of international law, if that Palestinian dies in prison, they withhold the body until that Palestinian has served their sentence. If you can imagine, Palestinians can't even bury their loved ones. They withhold the body. So every single tiny aspect of life, whether we have 3G or 4G, whether we plant a tree, whether we can get to medical appointments, whether we have enough to feed our children, whether we're able to access cancer treatment, whether we're able to bury our loved ones after they've been unjustly killed by the Israeli occupying regime in Israeli jails, Every single aspect of our life is completely managed by this regime, which is why this is an extremely significant judgment by the ICJ, because so many states around the world were denying this. I actually find it extremely significant that this time last year, the US Congress, the US House of Representatives, passed a bill saying that to even call Israel an apartheid regime was, that I think exactly what they said was they passed a resolution to say that Israel isn't a racist or apartheid state, and they conflated it with anti-Semitism. And even the EU High Representative of Foreign Policy, even last year in January, accusing Israel of apartheid is anti-Semitic. So we've come such a long way to now see the ICJ has taken everything that we already know, that there have been countless United Nations resolutions about, that there have been countless reports from international and local and regional human rights organizations, to actually be put down on paper, and an authoritative decision, interpretation of the law is now in place, that third states around the world can't really claim that this isn't happening anymore.
And of course, the European Union backing the ICJ ruling from Friday. Yes, you're right. So much has changed with regards to that. After the break, I continue my conversation with Zainah. The question we're asking is, will this make a difference? Will Israel abide to it? Because the history shows they actually don't. Do stay tuned after the break. We'll have more for you on News in Focus. Welcome back. I'm in conversation with Zainah Haroun. She is the spokesperson for Al-Haq, based in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. Zainah, we've seen the ICJ deliver two scathing judgments this year. Of course, this is prior to what happened on Friday. We've seen that a resolution was passed in the UN Security Council for there to be an immediate ceasefire. Israel has a history of not abiding to hundreds of resolutions passed by the United Nations. And you would know best, living in Ramallah, in the occupied West Bank, to speak about the mood on the ground as to whether people are actually buying the fact that Israel is actually going to abide by what happened on Friday. There is a little hope, is there? Because it's very difficult to see this current Israeli government really abiding to anything which has international law to it.
Well, as you mentioned, this is the second damning judgment this year by the International Court of Justice towards Israel and its policies, its ongoing genocide in Gaza, and of course, now the ruling that the occupation itself as a regime is unlawful. It's actually the third damning judgment by the ICJ towards Israel's settler colonial apartheid regime. 20 years ago, the ICJ ruled that the wall and Israel settlements in the West Bank are completely illegal. Have we seen any movement on that? No. In fact, we've seen an escalation of those settlements, especially since after the war on Gaza. Under the fog of war, the Israelis have approved the most significant settlement expansion in the West Bank. Unfortunately, while the ruling is extremely significant, it means nothing unless third states actually abide by their obligations, which are very serious, and that they have to abide by to actually put this into practice and to make this work and to hold Israel accountable. Now, even the UN Secretary General said that Israel the situation it has at the moment is total impunity. We need Israel to be held accountable. We need these third states to actually uphold their obligations. Now, I don't want to take away from the seriousness and how historic this judgment was, because even though it itself is non-binding, it does actually give an authoritative interpretation of the law in relation to what's happening here on the ground in the occupied Palestinian territory, on how to interpret the customary international law, which is binding, and third states do have a legal obligation to abide by that and to make that happen. And before, like I said, even though it was controversial and it seemed to be just activists or fringe groups, and certain officials could say, no, this is anti-Semitic, or no, this isn't the case, to have the World Court rule that it's unlawful and that there's a violation of Article 3 of the Third Convention, which prohibits apartheid and racial segregation, it changes everything in terms of policy, but changes nothing unless these states decide to act. Now, we've been very concerned after the ICJ said that there was plausible case of genocide in January in Gaza, that third states did not uphold their obligations under the Genocide Convention, especially those who had ratified the Genocide Convention. They're supposed to do everything in their power to protect that population from genocide. Instead, we saw so many third states cut off funding to UNRWA because of Israeli accusations that the staff members of UNRWA were involved in the October 7th attacks, which they failed to provide any evidence for. Now, instead of actually doing what they're obligated to do under the Genocide Convention, which was to protect them in every single way possible, so many states went to cut the funding for UNRWA, which was extremely alarming because it's the main lifeline for Palestinians in Gaza who are facing a manufactured Israeli-made famine. They also failed to stop arming Israel. So many states are still providing arms to Israel or parts of arms to Israel. Of course, the USA, of course, the UK is still providing, Germany is still providing. So it's incredibly problematic. So right now, we're at a pivotal point where so many people have been out on the streets in the global north. The global south has been a completely different story, has rallied around the Palestinian people, the governments. But in the global north, we've seen people on the streets rallying around the Palestinian people saying enough is enough, and saying that it's time to end the occupation, to end the settler colonial regime, to stop the genocide in Gaza. And at some point, something has to give, and governments have to listen. We've seen that with the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. We've seen that in various different movements in history. But when we come to the mood on the ground, Palestinians, it's almost become a curse word to use the term international law or to use the word human rights, unfortunately, because the international community has failed them repeatedly. When has international law ever helped them? When has human rights ever helped them? Especially now, as a genocide is being live streamed in Gaza, it's extremely difficult to convince a population, a captive population, that these international systems, where Israel has so many powerful allies, are actually going to come through for them and make a difference in their lives. But we hope to keep, as a human rights organization, as a civil society organization, we're going to continue to use this judgment, which we've been lobbying for, which we've been advocating for, which we've been doing so much work for years, for decades as a human rights organization, to continue to push forward to pursue the liberation of the Palestinian people.
Zainah, one final question. There are reports that the ICC is going to implement those war crime charges against Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu. I want to ask, how much does this now push even further support for the people of Palestine from the international community? South Africa has made it clear that it supports its liberation, especially many political parties within support the liberation of Palestine. But how much do you believe that pending arrest for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant is going to really allow for a more bigger international noise for the people of Palestine? Do you feel that even if it shakes the ground a little bit, it is shaking the ground still?
So Karim Khan has applied for those arrest warrants. They haven't actually been issued as of yet. And what we've seen is countries like the UK and Germany tried to use the Oslo Accords to reject the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court and say that those Israeli officials can't be tried. One of the other significant points of the ICJ judgment on Friday was that they said that this cannot be used. The Oslo Accords cannot be used as a way to dismiss Palestinian efforts to secure accountability for violations which are being committed against them. So that was extremely significant in that sense, because unfortunately we still saw those states trying to prevent accountability and trying to put a spanner in the works, or at least delay accountability, because even Karim Khan himself said that he was told off the record, you know, that these courts are mainly for African leaders. We don't actually use them for our friends or for Europeans. So this was incredibly problematic. So this judgment actually helped to clarify that for those states who are trying to delay or prevent the ICC from actually filing those arrest warrants if the pretrial chamber, the panel of judges, actually decides to do so. Now, if those arrest warrants are actually filed against those two Israeli leaders, including the Prime Minister, this would be the first crack in impunity against Israel and Israeli leaders, something that they've never experienced before because they've enjoyed total impunity for as long as they've existed. It's something that we've known as Palestinians, even if they were held accountable, even in a minor way, something that we've actually witnessed on the ground. When the Khan al-Ahmar Bedouin community was under the threat of demolition, the former general prosecutor of the ICC warned Israel that it would be a war crime if they demolished that community. And they felt the fear from just a verbal warning, and they didn't demolish the Khan al-Ahmar Bedouin community. And at the time we thought, wow, this is just a verbal warning that accountability could be a consequence to their actions, stop them from doing that to a Palestinian community, did so much. Imagine if there was actual, solid, concrete measures to hold Israel accountable, what we've managed to do here in terms of ending the violations, ending the illegal occupation. So, of course, they'd be extremely significant if those arrest warrants were actually filed, and it would crack that impunity that Israel has enjoyed for so long.
Zainah, shukran so much for joining us here on Hilaal TV. Much appreciated. We hope to have you soon again on our shows. Assalamu alaikum.
Very much.
That's Zainah Haroun. She is the spokesperson for Al-Haq based in Ramallah in the West Bank. Yes, the ICJ has delivered its verdict. The question is Israel going to abide? History shows that's not really the case. But, as Zainah mentioned, if those arrest warrants for Yoav Gallant and Benjamin Netanyahu go through, that could be the first potential shaking of the ground in terms of holding these Israeli leaders accountable for the genocide that is currently happening in Gaza. We wait to see what happens with regards to that. That's all we have for you here on News in Focus. From myself, Faraz Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.